They thought your kindness was a weakness. They saw your patience and mistook it for permission. In their eyes, your compassion was something to manipulate, not to honor. But what they never understood, what they refused to see, is that your kindness was never a flaw. It was a choice, a disciplined strength, a quiet storm. While they used your open heart to feed their ego, they didn't realize they were writing a debt their soul would one day be forced to pay. Now, the tables have turned. The ones who once laughed at your loyalty are whispering prayers into the silence. And those who once used your light to navigate their darkness are now trembling in the very shadows they created. Kindness is not weakness, it's restrained power. There's a dangerous lie circulating in the world, the idea that kindness belongs only to the timid, the weak, or the easily manipulated. That lie has done more harm than people realize. Because the moment someone mistakes gentleness for a lack of strength, they unlock a slow-burning tragedy, one where good people are quietly drained, dismissed, and discarded. But true kindness, real kindness, is not the act of someone powerless. It is the strength of someone who could retaliate but chooses not to. It is control. It is moral discipline. It is the courage to hold back the storm even when provoked. You weren't kind because you didn't see the truth. You were kind despite knowing it. You saw the red flags. You felt the tension. You heard the sharp edge in their voice when they spoke behind your back or used you for their own gain. But you gave anyway. You loved anyway. Because in your heart, you weren't playing a game. You weren't pretending. You weren't being kind to gain leverage or to look good. You are being who you are, someone who knows that the world is heavy enough and that maybe, just maybe, a soft answer could make it lighter for someone. And that's the part they never understood. People who feed off manipulation don't know how to measure integrity. They live by the illusion that dominance is power, that the loudest one wins, that the cruelest one survives. So when they encountered your warmth, they misread it. They thought, this one is soft, this one is easy, this one won't fight back. What a miscalculation, what a shallow lens to view a deep soul through. Because had they looked closer, they would have seen it. The fire behind your kindness, the grit behind your grace. Kindness is not weakness. It is the choice not to unleash all that lives within you. It is the decision to take your pain and not pass it on, to carry the weight and still choose compassion. That takes an emotional stamina they will never understand. Anyone can lash out. Anyone can retaliate. But to be still, to remain good in a world that's begging you to be bitter, that is power. Not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that builds character. Quietly, unshakably. But here's the deeper truth. People who exploit kindness are often running from their own emptiness. They think if they can use someone else's goodness, maybe they won't have to confront their own lack of it. They feed on it like it's endless. They come back for more, expecting you to always be available, always be giving, always be quiet. And for a while you were, because you believed in giving people a chance. You believed that maybe your loyalty would awaken theirs, that maybe your patience would teach them something about love. But they weren't listening. They weren't learning. They were taking and taking, until the silence you offered out of peace turned into a silence they mistook for permission. That's where everything begins to change, because kindness has a limit. Not because you stopped being kind, but because you finally started being kind to yourself. You began to realize that allowing someone to drain your spirit is not compassion, it's self-abandonment. That standing silently while someone crosses your boundaries isn't mercy, it's quiet suffering. So you pulled back, not out of revenge, not out of hate, but out of self-respect. And suddenly, the same people who once took your grace for granted began to feel the absence of your light. And in that absence, they started to confront the truth that what they thought was weakness was actually the only strength they ever had access to. They never feared your anger, but they deeply underestimated the power of your absence. And when someone who once held you in contempt begins to feel the weight of losing you, that's when the begging begins. That's when the apologies show up, late, scattered, desperate. Not because they've suddenly grown, but because they've realized what they've broken and that it may never return. Mercy becomes a plea only when someone finally understands the cost of what they destroyed. So now they say you've changed. But no, you've returned to yourself. You haven't become bitter, you've become honest. You've learned the sacred value of your energy. You've learned that kindness is a gift, not a duty. That your time, your presence, your heart, all of it is sacred. And it should only be offered to those who can recognize its worth before they lose it. This is what many will never comprehend. The strongest people aren't the ones who shout the loudest or demand the most. The strongest people are the ones who love without needing control, who give without needing applause, and who leave without needing revenge. That is real strength. That is restrained power. And that is why your kindness, the very thing they used, will now be the echo that haunts them. Because they didn't just lose a person. They lost a sanctuary they didn't even realize they were living in. The misuse of goodness always carries a spiritual debt. There is something deeply sacred about goodness. It doesn't scream. It doesn't demand credit. It doesn't seek dominance. It just exists quietly, powerfully, like a river that carves through stone over time. But when someone misuses that goodness, when they take it as something to manipulate rather than honor, they don't just violate a person. They violate something moral, something eternal. And whether they realize it or not, they create a debt, a spiritual one that cannot be erased by excuses or delayed by time. Life remembers, and it always collects. The problem is that most people only think in terms of short-term gain. They ask themselves, what can I get right now? How far can I go without being caught? How much can I take before they walk away? That mindset is rooted in immaturity, in a blindness to the long arc of truth. When someone uses your loyalty for their convenience, they believe they've won. When they exploit your compassion to serve their ego, they see themselves as smarter, more strategic, but what they fail to grasp is that life, in all its mystery, keeps its own scorecard. And that score isn't settled in moments, it's settled in consequences. You see, the spiritual world doesn't operate like the material one. In the material world, you can steal and lie and manipulate, and sometimes no one notices. You can rise by climbing over people, and it may even look like success. But in the spiritual world, in the place where character is forged and fate takes shape, every action carries weight. Every betrayal stains the soul. Every misuse of another's love creates a fracture in the spirit, a tear that doesn't heal through apology alone. It demands something deeper: repentance, transformation, and accountability. People think they're getting away with something when they use a kind heart for selfish gain, but they're not getting away. They're getting away with less. less of their own soul intact, less of their integrity preserved, less peace in the silence of their own mind. Because deep down, something always knows. The conscience might sleep for a while, buried under pride or rationalization, but eventually it wakes, and when it does, it speaks in a voice no one can ignore. This is why you don't need to seek revenge. You don't need to expose them, fight them, or convince them of their wrongdoing. Because life has its own justice system, it doesn't need your help. The ones who used your kindness may mock you in the moment. They may tell others that you were too sensitive, too emotional, or too trusting. But when the doors close, when they're alone with themselves, their own soul begins to whisper, and those whispers turn into echoes. And those echoes, if ignored, become torment. There is a law older than any courtroom, the law of return. What you put into others, you eventually confront in yourself. When someone chooses manipulation over honesty, betrayal over loyalty, exploitation over compassion, they are setting up a future version of themselves for collapse. Maybe not today, maybe not even next year, but eventually the cost shows up. And when it does, they'll look around and wonder why they feel empty, restless, disconnected. They'll call it bad luck. But it won't be luck. It'll be the unpaid debt of their own character. And what about you? The one who gave, the one who believed, the one who kept showing up, even when your soul was bruised. You may have been left with scars. You may have questioned your worth. But here's what you must remember. You never lost when you loved with truth. You never diminished yourself by giving. Because even though it hurt, and yes, it did hurt, you remained real in a world that thrives on imitation. You stayed human in a culture that rewards indifference. And that matters. It matters in ways you cannot always see. Because while they were building castles on sand, you were building roots. And roots, though slow, are what survive storms. That goodness they mocked, it became your protection. That compassion they misused, it became your strength. And that truth you carried, the one they tried to twist or silence, it will be the very light that guides you out of the shadows they left behind. Eventually, they will realize what they did, not through your words, but through their own unraveling. When the people they once used begin to leave, when the admiration they once received turns to distrust, when the walls they built to feel powerful become the very prison that isolates them, that is the spiritual debt being collected. And it's not punishment, it's balance. It's life restoring what was broken. So you don't have to carry the weight of their actions anymore. You don't have to make them see. The story will tell itself. And the same heart they once took for granted, the one that stayed silent, that offered grace, that chose peace, will be the one they remember when the noise fades and the guilt begins. Because what they did wasn't just wrong, it was a betrayal of something sacred. And that kind of betrayal never disappears quietly. It echoes forever. Silence is not surrender, it is dignity under fire. In a world that glorifies noise, many people mistake silence for defeat. They believe the one who yells the loudest is the one who's winning. That if you're not clapping back, defending yourself, or making a scene, you must be weak, afraid, passive, or broken. But that belief comes from a deep misunderstanding of what real strength looks like. Because silence, when chosen with awareness, is not surrender, it is dignity under fire. It is the quiet act of someone who refuses to give their pain away in exchange for momentary validation. When you chose to stay silent while others misjudged you, it wasn't because you had nothing to say. You had 1,000 things to say. You had truths to tell, wounds to uncover, and stories that could have shattered their carefully built lies. But you didn't. Not because you couldn't, but because you decided your peace was worth more than their chaos. You chose stillness over spectacle, and that's a kind of bravery most people will never understand. It takes restraint to walk away when your name is being dragged through the mud. It takes discipline not to retaliate when lies are being spoken about you, when people twist your story to fit their narrative. And it takes strength, real strength, to let people think they've won, knowing deep down that your silence is not a loss. It is protection. It is sacred space. It is a shield you place over your soul to preserve what's left after being wounded by people who never knew how to value it in the first place. Some people crave conflict, not because they want truth, but because they want attention. They stir the pot, provoke reactions, and then play the victim when you finally explode. So when you chose not to play that game, when you chose silence over shouting, you didn't lose power. You claimed it. You took control of the narrative by stepping outside of it. You left the stage instead of performing for an audience that never cared about your truth to begin with. And here's the irony. The very people who provoked your silence are the ones most haunted by it. At first, they may have celebrated. They thought your silence meant guilt or shame or submission. But over time, that silence becomes a mirror. And in that mirror, they begin to see themselves. Not the version they sell to others, but the one they try to hide from. The one that manipulated, that lied, that tore down someone who only ever wanted peace. And the longer you remain silent, the louder their conscience begins to scream. Silence also exposes character, not just theirs, but yours. When you choose not to retaliate, not to speak ill in return, not to play dirty, even when dirt was thrown at you, you reveal a kind of integrity that can't be faked. You show the world, and more importantly yourself, that your values aren't conditional. You don't stop being kind just because someone else was cruel. You don't stop being respectful just because someone else was disrespectful. That level of maturity is rare, and it's costly, but it's worth everything. You may have cried in silence. You may have screamed into your pillow, questioning why your loyalty was met with betrayal. You may have had moments where you wanted to break the silence, not out of clarity, but out of desperation, just to be seen, to be heard, to make someone understand the depth of your pain. But even in those moments, you didn't let your emotions write your story. You gave yourself room to grieve without turning bitter. You gave yourself time to process without becoming destructive. That is emotional wisdom. That is self-leadership. In your silence, something else was happening too. You were healing. You were gathering strength. You were reconnecting with the voice inside you that doesn't need anyone's approval to be valid. The silence became a sanctuary, a place where the noise of the world couldn't reach you, where you began to remember who you were before the betrayal. And from that place, you began to rise, not with noise, but with clarity, not with anger, but with alignment, not with vengeance, but with vision. And now they're the ones who can't sleep. They're the ones refreshing your page, rereading old messages, waiting for a reaction that will never come. Because what they wanted was to keep you tethered, to keep you explaining, defending, and chasing closure. But your silence broke the cycle. It ended the loop. And now they're left alone with what they did. That is the cost of trying to destroy someone who chose dignity over drama. So the next time someone questions your silence, when they say, "Why didn't you speak up? Why didn't you fight back?" You can smile quietly because you'll know that silence was your answer. It was the most eloquent, powerful response you could have given. It said, "I know who I am. I don't need to prove it to anyone who never saw me to begin with." Because silence, when chosen in truth, doesn't shrink you, it refines you. It makes space for the truth to reveal itself in time. And in that space, those who tried to use you will slowly realize, not through your words, but through your absence, that what they lost wasn't someone weak. It was someone noble enough to remain silent in a world addicted to noise. Life keeps score in ways the world cannot see. We live in a world obsessed with appearances, with visible wins, loud victories, and public approval. People measure success by what can be seen, who's ahead, who has more followers, who gets the last word. But beneath all of that noise, beneath the surface of what's trending or talked about, there is another system at work, a quieter, older, and far more accurate one. It's the system of life itself, and life, unlike people, never forgets. It keeps score in ways no one else can track, not with applause or attention, but with truth. You may have walked away from people who treated you like you were disposable. You may have stepped back without saying a word while they painted a story that made them look like the hero and you the fool. And for a while, it might have seemed like they won. They kept your name out of the light, claimed the moral high ground, convinced others that they were innocent. But life is not fooled by performance. It watches, it waits, and it weighs every decision not by how it looks, but by what it actually costs. Some debts can't be measured in dollars or reputation. They're measured in integrity lost, in peace disturbed, in relationships broken by betrayal. When someone uses your trust, your kindness, your presence, not as something to cherish, but as something to consume, they may not see the fallout right away, but that's the illusion. Just because consequences are delayed doesn't mean they're denied. Life has its own rhythm, and its justice doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it arrives in silence. The one who broke you might still be smiling. They might even be thriving on the outside. But don't confuse that with peace. Because the scoreboard of life isn't found in followers' status or social validation. It's found in what you feel when you're alone, in how you sleep at night, in whether you look in the mirror and recognize the person staring back. And when someone has built their wins on another's wounds, that mirror becomes a heavy thing to face. You see, life is not transactional the way people think. You don't just do wrong and walk away. You don't just manipulate someone's spirit and go untouched. You don't leave someone in the ashes of their loyalty and expect to live in the sunlight forever. There's a reckoning, not imposed by others, but created from within. A spiritual erosion begins to unfold slowly, quietly, but undeniably. And eventually, the imbalance becomes too great to hide. This is why you didn't need to get even, why you didn't have to play dirty or expose their lies, because life was already doing the work. While you were healing in silence, it was setting things in motion, not to punish, but to restore, to correct what was thrown out of alignment. That's how life works, not by force, but by balance. and balance always returns, even when the world says it won't. The most dangerous thing anyone can do is assume that their actions exist in isolation, that what they did to you won't ripple outward, that breaking your spirit won't eventually break something in them. But everything we do leaves a fingerprint on our conscience, on our future, on our relationships. And when someone breaks good things for temporary gain, they are cutting themselves off from something far more valuable than they know. It may take years, but the time comes. The mask begins to slip. The facade starts to crack. The life they built on the backs of others begins to collapse under its own weight, and it's not always dramatic. Sometimes the fall looks like emptiness, like relationships that won't last, like a haunting silence in the moments they should feel joy, like a deep hunger that no achievement can satisfy, because no amount of success can silence a guilty soul forever. And you, the one they underestimated, you begin to rise. Quietly, steadily, not because you forced it, but because you stayed aligned with who you are. You didn't let their betrayal rewrite your identity. You didn't let bitterness become your language. You chose growth over revenge, healing over hostility. And life, the same life that watched you cry in silence, is now building something around you that cannot be taken because it wasn't built on manipulation. It was built on truth. There's a power in that. In knowing that justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's personal. Sometimes it shows up in the peace you now have, in the people who see you for who you truly are, in the way your story begins to shine, not because you forced it, but because you stayed true to yourself through it all. So let the world forget. Let them believe what they want. The real scoreboard isn't public, it's spiritual. And in that realm, every seed planted, whether in love or in betrayal, grows into something that cannot be hidden forever. That's why you can walk forward with your head held high, not because you were never wounded, but because you didn't let your wounds turn you into someone. And that is what life honors. That is what it remembers. Not the ones who shouted, but the ones who stayed rooted when everything around them shook. The ones who gave what they could and walked away when it was no longer safe to stay. The ones who chose soul over spectacle. Because in the end, that's where the real scoreboard lies, not in the eyes of others, but in the quiet, unwavering justice of life itself. The return of power to the one who is taken for granted. There comes a moment when everything shifts, not with drama or noise, but with undeniable clarity. The one who was overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed begins to rise. Not out of revenge, not to prove something, but because truth has its own gravity, and it pulls the neglected back into their rightful place. This is the return of power to the one who was taken for granted. People often don't notice the value of what's always been there. When someone shows up with consistency, kindness, and presence, it becomes easy to assume they always will. They get labeled as the strong one, the understanding one, or the one who never leaves. And over time, others stop seeing them as a person with needs, limits, and emotions, and instead start seeing them as a resource to use, not a soul to cherish. But what's overlooked is not erased, and what's taken for granted is not made any less valuable by someone else's blindness. The person who kept giving even when they were tired, the one who stayed quiet when they were hurting, the one who supported others even while silently falling apart. They hold a strength the world tries to exploit, but that strength doesn't vanish. It simply waits. It waits for the day they stop handing it out to those who only know how to consume it. That day always comes. It may arrive quietly, after years of giving and receiving little in return. It may come in the form of a single moment, a realization, a final betrayal, or a moment of stillness where everything becomes clear. But once the one who was taken for granted awakens to their own worth, everything changes. They stop shrinking to fit into places that never honored them. They stop over-explaining themselves to people who never tried to understand, and they stop accepting crumbs while offering a feast. The return of power is not about becoming hard or bitter. It's about no longer settling for less than what's aligned with your truth. It's about seeing your worth not through the eyes of those who dismissed you, but through the lens of your own healing. When that shift happens, the dynamic changes. Suddenly, the one who used to be available for every call, every emergency, every need becomes scarce, not out of cruelty, but out of wisdom. They finally realize that energy is sacred, and where it's spent matters. And that absence, it speaks volumes. The very people who once overlooked you begin to feel your absence like a shadow. They may not say it out loud, but they notice the difference. The texts don't get replies as quickly. The support doesn't flow as freely. The unconditional presence has turned into healthy boundaries. And that's when the regret begins. Not because they've changed, but because they've lost access to something they assumed would always be there. It's ironic how the one who was never seen fully becomes unforgettable the moment they reclaim themselves. Because power isn't loud. It's not in titles or attention. True power is quiet confidence. It's the ability to walk away with grace, to protect your peace instead of proving your point, to love yourself enough not to wait for others to finally recognize what they were blind to all along. There's a strange freedom in realizing you don't need closure from the people who wounded you, that you don't need validation from those who failed to value you. The return of power is the return of sovereignty, a recognition that you are the author of your emotional life, and no one gets to co-write your story without permission. When you were taken for granted, it wasn't because you lacked value, it was because others lacked vision. They couldn't see the depth of what you carried. They mistook your forgiveness for permission. They confused your softness for weakness. But life has a way of revealing the truth over time. And eventually, even the blind begin to see what they've lost, not because you reminded them, but because your absence began to reflect everything your presence once provided. What a gift that is. To know that you no longer need to prove anything, that your worth is no longer up for negotiation, that your power, once scattered across people who never deserved it, has returned home to you. That power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives in the form of silence, of no longer reacting, of moving on, of glowing without needing applause. So now you rise, not to seek revenge, but to reclaim your life, not to show them what they lost, but to finally enjoy who you are without needing them to understand. You rise because you were never meant to be invisible. You were never meant to live in the margins of your own story. You were always meant to lead it, to own it, to speak it with courage. This is the return, not to what you were before they hurt you, but to something deeper, wiser, and more whole. A version of you that knows the cost of being taken for granted and has vowed never to pay that price again. A version that gives freely, but only where it is cherished. that listens deeply, but only where it is heard, that loves fiercely, but only where it is safe. The return of power isn't just a moment, it's a transformation. And it begins the second you decide you are no longer available to be used, silenced, or overlooked. You are no longer theirs to take for granted. You are yours now, fully, finally, fiercely.